because we've had a few questions at the Guild about how do we cover some of the things that are happening in New Zealand in our rural communities, and how do we cover what we're seeing there? Because some people have been seeing, like some of our friends and colleagues and co-workers and family descending down a bit of a rabbit hole over COVID. And luckily, we've got Byron here, who's been kind of viewing what's been happening over the last number of years and has just published his book about it, which I will link to in the chat if you haven't seen it already. But it came out last month and it covers in quite a lot of detail kind of what's happening in the rural communities. I think what we've been seeing, and I'm sure you'll go into it, so I won't cover it too much, but kind of that pivot from anti-vax to anti-climate change and some of the rhetoric around that. So it's timely. So thank you, Byron, for writing your book. It's been awesome to read. I read it in a weekend and it was really fascinating and horrifying at the same time. So what I will do is just hand over to you to introduce yourself, and I'll keep an eye on the chat. If anyone's got any questions while Byron's talking, you can add them to the chat. And then afterwards, I'm sure you'll have a few minutes to kind of just discuss anything that people want to talk about. But
yeah, definitely keen to have some Q&A. But to give a bit of an introduction, as Sarah said, I'm the author of the recently published book, Fear, New Zealand's Hostile Underworld of Extremists. And there is a fair bit in there that concerns rural communities, in particular the chapter titled Rural Rebellion, Populism in the Provinces, which builds on an article that I wrote for that was published in Newsroom about a group called Agriculture Action Group. Now, to give a bit of background on that group, they were formed on election night in 2020 by several advanced New Zealand candidates. And they formed basically because the Advanced New Zealand Party failed to get into Parliament, and they wanted to start targeting, in particular, people in rural New Zealand with the same sorts of conspiracy theories that Advanced New Zealand had been promoting. So I have a chapter on Advanced New Zealand in the book that goes into it a bit as well. I'm also currently writing an article that'll be published later in the year in Pacific Journalism Review, which is an open access academic journal, so that'll be available for anyone to read. And that article is looking at how a lot of these conspiracy theories, conspiracy theory groups and communities are pivoting from COVID conspiracies to climate change conspiracies. But the climate change conspiracies aren't new. Billy Tikahika, when he was starting his Facebook live streams that eventually led to him starting a political party, was promoting a lot of misinformation about United Nations Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. You may be familiar with this. This was a sustainable development plan that came out of the Earth Summit in 1992, signed by 178 world leaders, and it's quite a large document, over 1,000 pages, and it concerns a whole number of things, but around how we reduce fossil fuel consumption and develop in a more sustainable direction. But Agenda 2021 has been the source of conspiracy theories for quite some time, most of them coming out of the United States, promoted initially by a group called the John Birch Society, which are a very long-standing sort of conspiracy theorist group. They started at a meeting in 1958, and they believed that there was an international communist conspiracy to bring about a one world government that would be a sort of global tyrannical police state. And they saw the United Nations as being part of the means for this to happen. So they've for a long time been promoting the idea that the UN is part of this communist conspiracy to have a one world government. And when Agenda 2021 came along, they incorporated that into that conspiracy theory. So seeing it as part of an agenda to erode national sovereignty by having the UN dictate to member states like how they would develop, how they would run their economies, and so on. So Billy Tikahika was influenced by a lot of that, perhaps not directly from the John Birch Society, because these ideas got picked up particularly by the Tea Party movement, which, if you remember, during the Obama era, that was sort of the right of the Republican Party. Before we got the more Trump right, it was sort of a precursor to that, very influenced by a lot of these conspiracies around the UN, and they've been promoted by people like Alex Jones on InfoWars as well. So that strand was running through Advance New Zealand, and then when Advance New Zealand failed to be elected to Parliament, three candidates formed Agriculture Action Group, and they held meetings in a lot of small towns in the provinces where they would promote these conspiracies about climate change being some sort of a hoax being used by the world's elite to bring about their agenda. And the supposed agenda that's being pushed is things like, banning meat consumption, depopulating rural areas, making everyone move into cities. Other conspiracies have been brought into this, as well as conspiracies about the UN. There's a lot about the World Economic Forum, who during the pandemic put out a book called The Great Reset, where they saw this global pandemic as an opportunity to change the global economy and change how we do things. And this was seen as, yet another example of the elites trying to reshape the world in their own interests through the sinister agenda that they were using COVID to push through. So I've noticed a real similarity between the narratives around COVID and the narratives around climate change. So the pandemic was seen as, a reason that the world's elites could implement their agenda of a global government and global communism and making everyone vegan and so forth. And that conspiracy worked whether you believed COVID was real or not. So you could believe COVID was really happening, but it was being taken advantage of, or you could believe that COVID was a hoax that was used for this agenda, or at the more fringe of the conspiracies, you could believe that COVID was some sort of bioweapon deliberately released to push this agenda. And so a similar thing is there with climate change. Someone can believe that climate change is real, but it's being taken advantage of by the world's elites to push this agenda. Or you can believe that climate change is just a hoax by those elites for that agenda, and you can say, well, we've always had extreme weather events and everything's natural and so on. And then again, there's the more fringe of the conspiracy theory, where you could believe that things like the cyclone we recently saw are man-made events, like through weather manipulation technologies or things like that. So whether you're kind of a more moderate conspiracy theorist or a more out there fringe conspiracy theorist, you can be part of this meta narrative, that there's a group of elites who are trying to remake the world. And I think we've seen some of the influence of these views in things like the Groundswell protests. I don't see Groundswell as being a extremist group. I think many of them have arguably legitimate concerns. I might personally disagree with some of their politics just from where I am, but I certainly don't see them as being an inherently disinformation group the way I would describe like Agriculture Action Group. But Agriculture Action Group, as well as Voices for Freedom, who are another group that emerged out of former Advance New Zealand candidates, were involving themselves in the Groundswell protests, including as organisers in some locations. And that's I think where some of these ideas crept in, calling Jacinda Ardern a communist or a stooge of the World Economic Forum or the UN or so forth. So these conspiracy theories are having an influence in rural New Zealand, and I think that means it's important that anyone who is covering some of these issues is aware of where some of these narratives are coming from and what they have their roots in, and who's spreading them and in whose interests. The other one that ties into it, which I have another chapter on, is the sovereign citizen conspiracy theories. And this is a sort of pseudo law that is believed by a number of sort of fringe groups. And the idea is essentially that you can pick and choose which laws apply to you by using kind of legal cheat codes. Like an example is if you're being arrested and the officer asks if you understand, they're apparently actually asking if you stand under them and consent to their arrest. So, you might have seen, if you've watched like some of the footage of the anti-lockdown protests, people yelling, "I do not understand, I do not stand under," and that's where that sort of comes from. But some of these ideas have been promoted by Agriculture Action Group when they've been holding their meetings. Like they've been telling people, don't let agents of the government onto your land, and you can be a sovereign citizen over your own land, and you don't have to abide by environmental regulations and so forth. So they're spreading this misinformation, not just about these big global issues like climate change, but misinformation about what people's legal obligations are and supposed ways that they can get out of this. So it's a bit of a spiel, but yeah, I think if we do this meeting largely around questions and answers, I'd be really happy to hear what people have to ask or what they have to add. Or
there were just a couple of things that I had noted down that I wanted to ask you about, because I do know that you've been kind of monitoring the telegrams of a lot of these fringe groups. What's been happening since Jacinda Ardern stepped down? Like, what is the narrative since then? Because she copped a lot of vitriol. So
yeah,
has that
so
taken the sting out, or is it just pivoted to something else?
Yeah, well, Jacinda Ardern really was a lightning rod for a lot of that vitriol, and I think there were a few different reasons for that. Some of it was just misogyny, people not liking a woman in a leadership position, or a woman that they saw as particularly strong-willed or whatever. There was also, from some sectors that I monitor on the far right, a lot of anger towards Ardern due to the way that she responded to the mosque shooting in 2019. Things like wearing the hijab, the adhan being played on RNZ and TVNZ, which was seen by some sort of fringe evangelical Christian groups and others who hold quite strongly anti-Islam views as being a capitulation to Islam. And so she got a lot of flack for that reason. And yeah, and I think others as well, just seeing her as describing her as a socialist or a communist, part of that being because she had been part of the what do they call that, International Socialist Youth, which isn't really a radical communist organization. It's the Labour Party, and Labour parties around the West have their roots in socialist organizations, or social democratic organizations as they're called in Europe, and the name socialist has been retained by this one group, but that's all influenced it. So with her stepping down, I've seen a lot of these groups try and say, it's not just about Ardern. Hipkins is also part of this same agenda, and many of those groups saying, not just Hipkins, but Luxon as well. There's a large billboard that's been made by a conspiracy theorist who lives in Waiuku, who drives around with a billboard trailer, and previously had signs, comparing Ardern to Hitler, and quotes from Orwell's 1984 and all this stuff. And he's got a big new sign now, which shows Chris Hipkins and Christopher Luxon as marionettes being puppeted by Klaus Schwab, who's the chairman of the World Economic Forum. So he's, that gives you a sort of visual example of what their narrative is, that all these political leaders are part of this elite global agenda. So I think they haven't successfully whipped up as much hatred of these individuals as there was for Ardern, but the leading influences in this space are definitely trying to make it, it's not just about Ardern, it's about, you know, this global conspiracy, and whoever's in charge of New Zealand is part of it.
We've had a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll just read them out if that's easier, unless Phil, you wanted to speak to yours. But Phil's asked, he's met a farming family who work in a deep in the Great Reset Agenda 21 rabbit hole. They're also evangelicals. Have you seen much of a streak of that in farming groups? And Gerald Piddock has also asked, you know, like how widespread or embedded are these ideas in the rural community?
So I have a chapter on the Christian right in the book as well, looking at, you know, how that has contributed to, you know, the global the sort of ecosystem of the alternative right in New Zealand. And there were, among those groups, there was a lot of anger at the government for the public health response to the pandemic, particularly things that stopped people being able to gather for church services. And a lot of that came out of a evangelical belief that, you know, the government should be a lower authority than God, and God should be the ultimate authority. So anything that the government was doing that appeared to be usurping that divine authority was seen as tyrannical. So that was one of the reasons a lot of these people criticizing the government for lockdowns and other restrictions were claiming the government was tyrannical, not that they had necessarily restricted the rights of citizens, but that they'd overstepped their supposed role within that governing structure, with divine power at the top and then earthly power below it. So yeah, the evangelical Christian community has formed part of, you know, what I broadly term the alternative right. Conspiracy theories like you know, QAnon, which uses a lot of language which comes out of evangelical Christianity, like a great awakening, this idea that there'll be a moment in time where people will become aware of, you know, what's going on. And that's a phrase that comes out of American evangelical Christianity. There've been a number of great awakening events throughout history, and a lot of the narrative that has developed around QAnon has really borrowed from some of these evangelical Christian ideas in the United States. So that's been a sector of the population that's been, I think, more susceptible to a lot of these different conspiracy theories. How much that overlaps with farmers or the rural community, though, I'm not entirely sure. I did for that chapter on evangelical Christianity, spoke to a woman named Hannah Blake, who has become an activist speaking out mostly about Christian homeschooling in New Zealand, which she was raised in. And in recent years, she started to see so many similarities between what the alt-right are saying and what she grew up with, you know, in that environment. And one thing she did mention to me, which I don't think I quoted this in the book, but she talked about evangelicals moving away from what they called sinful centers. So moving away from, you know, these urban areas where there was sin and debauchery, and instead trying to build communities in, you know, in more provincial centers. So possibly those kind of thoughts are a bit more proportionally, a bit more prominent in the provinces than they are in the big cities. It'd be, yeah, something interesting to learn more about, because I'm not sure how much that overlap is there, but I'm sure there's going to be some overlap there.
I guess when you're talking about some of those things that were stopped during the lockdowns, hunting was one of them, and that came out quite strongly in the kind of rural press about why that was. And there was quite a bit of resistance to that kind of infringement on people's rights to go and hunt and gather their own foods. So following on from some of that conversation, I guess we're seeing in the US more, or on TikTok even, that trad wife movement, you know, like women stay at home and play housemaker, and men go out and kind of, I guess, farm and hunt and work and and bring the money home. So I guess maybe, is there anything around that you're seeing around that on the places that you lurk?
Yeah. So there's a chapter in the book on women in the alt-right, which an abridged version of that was published on the spin-off, so you can read that. And yeah, one of the components of that is this so-called trad wife movement, and it's women who want to, adopt a more traditional gender role, the idea of being a stay-at-home wife and mother who does the domestic work and raises the children, or ideally homeschools the children, because that gets them away from the supposedly like liberal indoctrination of public schooling, where they'll learn about woke history and climate change and so on, or in the case of evangelicals, gets them away from that secular education, and that again has some overlap with existing communities who might be homeschooling their children for religious reasons already, and then the alt-right's kind of adopting some of that. And that's like I mentioned, Hannah Blake, that was one of the things she noticed that resulted in her becoming an activist around this. So I think those sort of ideas perhaps maybe more popular in rural areas in the provinces. A lot of the narrative that the alt-right is pushing is, it's conservatism. It's that things were better in the past, and that past is really kind of imagined. But I think in particular, if you look at like urban New Zealand today, it's increasingly multicultural, especially somewhere like Auckland. There's a bigger presence of the LGBT community, and if you see those things as degeneracy or things like that, then you might be looking at the sort of more romanticized idea of rural life as something better, and so that could appeal to people in rural areas who maybe are looking at the cities and thinking, oh, what's this country become? And certainly in the US, which is a much more divided society than we are, there's people joke on Twitter about there being like a fear of cities, which has a bit of truth to it. Like people who don't live in cities and don't often go to cities have come to believe that cities are these places where there's crime and there's rioting, and Black Lives Matter are burning down buildings, and Antifa are targeting conservatives, and all these sort of ridiculous things like that. And part of that is like the cable news environment they have there, and the emphasis on crime reporting and that sort of thing, which can give a distorted picture of what urban life in the US is like. And then I think that leads to people further romanticizing rural life, and we may start to see a little bit of that here. I think the reason we don't is that we don't have those stark divisions they do in the US, and we don't have the same media environment. I mean, people here are largely watching the same news, listening to the same radio, although things that might be changing that are these new online platforms like the Platform and the new one, Reality Check Radio, which has come out of Voices for Freedom. It's become possible now for people to really completely disengage with mainstream media and only consume this alternative media, and that's been doable for a while if you just consume the stuff coming from overseas. But now there's a lot of this alternative media that is homegrown, and so that could lead to more of a political divide like there is in the US, and I think that could very well line up on urban provincial lines to an extent as well.
And unlike radio or television, like traditional broadcasts, there's no standards for what gets published on the internet, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So we had a question from Lee Catley about how farmers love using social media. Do you think that makes them more vulnerable to going along with what the extremist groups are
Yeah.
doing and saying? Yeah.
I think anyone who's using a lot of social media is going to be more vulnerable. So I look a lot in the book at the role of social media algorithms, and these have been studied by a number of people, in particular the American sociologist Jesse Daniels, who I cite an older work of hers looking at racism online, and then a more recent one looking particularly at algorithms. And she's seen the modern far right as being a combination of centuries old racism and our modern sort of algorithm driven social media. So how it works on platforms like Facebook or YouTube is it will feed you content that it thinks you want to see, and the idea is the more content you're watching with that platform, the more time your eyes are on the screen to see the advertising that platform is serving up. So what this has led to, and it wasn't sort of by design to give people more and more divisive content, but it just sort of evolved this way, that a way to keep people watching is to give them content that will give them a really emotional response, get them riled up, get them angry. So somebody might start out watching a relatively mainstream political commentator, and then the algorithm would then serve up somebody a little bit more extreme. So you might start watching Jordan Peterson for some self-help advice, and I think there's some fairly good self-help advice like in Jordan Peterson's work, although he has a very conservative worldview that I think can sometimes serve as a gateway into more extreme thinking. So if you're consuming his content on YouTube, and then the algorithm fed you next Stefan Molyneux, who has a more extreme and a more openly racist worldview. Jordan Peterson believes that there's no kind of structural oppression, just this ever-present dominance hierarchy that's existed from time immemorial, and he draws on a lot of dubious evolutionary psychology to promote this. And then Stefan Molyneux believes, yes, there's a hierarchy, and it's because some racial groups are just inherently more intelligent than others. So you could be watching Jordan Peterson and then get driven to Stefan Molyneux, and then you might from there get exposed to other ideas that perhaps are a bit too extreme for YouTube, but you'd be following links to other platforms. And similar thing on Facebook. You'd be fed content in your feed that was going to give you a bit of a emotional response and keep you there longer. Facebook actually did a number of their own internal studies looking at how their algorithms were affecting how people used the site. And one of the shocking statistics that came out of there was 64% of the people who had joined extremist sort of groups on Facebook had done so because the algorithm had recommended them. Like, here's a group that you might like. One of the experiments they did with one of their internal researchers, and this came out when Frances Hagen was a whistleblower on a lot of what was going on Facebook behind the scenes. The researcher created a profile, and the profile was a woman from the Midwestern US whose interests were child rearing, politics, and Christianity. And within a few days, based on that profile that they had built with just a few interests, she was starting to get served up like QAnon groups to join. And this was, I say she, but it's not a real person. It's just this persona that had been created to test what the algorithms were doing. And yeah, she was getting served up QAnon groups saying this might be something you'd be interested in joining. And this was at a time when Facebook had supposedly banned QAnon content. It was still happening. So I really think the more time that you're spending on social media, the more likely you're going to get pushed into one of these rabbit holes, because something that keeps you on Facebook or YouTube is you know, getting angry about something and wanting to, you know, get in the comments and express your opinion, and then meet with like-minded people and so on. And so you can have these groups recommended to you, and then you can form these communities online and start spending more time there. And you know, it was a particular problem during the pandemic and the lockdowns, because people were isolated from their usual social network, their offline social network of friends and family and co-workers, and spending a lot more time in these virtual communities, which have this possibility of being pushed into a rabbit hole and getting into some, you know, some fringe ideas that you never would have been exposed to if not for these technologies that are quite new and you know, have been developed and you know, not really been reined in by any kind of sort of regulation or anything, because they're all so new, and we're just kind of learning as we go how what effect all these technologies are having on our society, and you know, on media, and on how we socialize with one another.
So we have a question about Sean Plunkett, and you mentioned the platform before. So how much influence do you think Sean Plunkett and other broadcasters on the platform have? Not sure how much they believe in what they're touting. Do you think they're expressing
Yeah,
views just to provoke? And what do you think that effect is having?
yeah, yeah. I'm not sure with Sean Plunkett whether he's a true believer or whether he's just sort of identified a market. I used to listen to Sean Plunkett on Morning Report when I was at university, and you know, I saw him as a, you know, a very good, competent journalist. So seeing that this is going to be his legacy, you know, having this platform, you know, it's a little disappointing. I think he's going for a very small niche there, because before the platform there were already some of these fake news outlets like Counterspin Media, and what the platform seems to be going for is having a politics that's similar but being factual rather than being disinformation. So when the platform began, a lot of the people in the groups that I monitor, you know, were initially listening to it and enjoying that there was another voice saying a lot of things they agreed with, but then they really turned on Sean Plunkett when he started you know, dismissing anti-vaccine conspiracy theories and calling them nutters and so on. And I sort of felt, what's the audience for the platform? Because I think there's, you know, a conservative audience is already quite well catered for by News Talk ZB, and then the kind of audience that Counterspin Media has, and presumably that Reality Check Radio will have, you know, they specifically want the fake news. They want the conspiracies about vaccines and so on, whereas the platform was steering clear of that. So yeah, it's a very small space they're carving out. So I don't think that their influence is huge, but some of these fringe media, you know, could have the effect of sort of having their ideas, having their narrative sort of trickle up into larger media. You know, if somebody is interviewed on the platform, and then, you know, the things they say get covered in other media, and then they get invited on another show. You know, so it can have an influence that way. But yeah, at this stage, it sort of remains to be seen really exactly how much that influence is. Oh, I think you're on mute there, Sarah.
Just talk to myself, thanks. Glenn's just asked what role the extremist groups are likely to play in the upcoming election in either a formal or informal way.
Yeah. So there's a few sort of fringe parties who ran in the 2020 election. You know, Advanced New Zealand that I've mentioned. Another one is what was then called the Outdoors Party and is now called the Outdoors and Freedom Party, and that's led by Sue Gray, who's become a bit of a celebrity in the anti-vaccine world for in her role as a lawyer, taking on a lot of these cases against mandates and so forth. So we're likely to see not Advance New Zealand, because they've dissolved, but the Outdoors and Freedom Party running candidates and putting their viewpoints out there.
I'm not gonna lie, like the idea of outdoors and freedom, that sounds really nice.
It does sound good, yeah.
Good marketing for them, but also like...
Yeah, and I mean they've added the word freedom into their party name, because that's become, the narrative of all these groups, that they're fighting tyranny, the tyranny of, a government that's putting in place lockdowns and mandates and so on, or broadly the tyranny of, the UN and WEF and so forth. There's also the party that Brian Tamaki and Hina Tamaki are involved with, which I think is just called Freedoms NZ. It was initially meant to be like a coalition of fringe parties, but I think they're actually the only one that's in it. And then there's also the New Conservatives, who are a bit closer to the mainstream, but certainly have a fringe within them that is susceptible to a lot of this conspiratorial thinking. Maybe a bit less so this year than in 2020. They've got a new leadership, but some of the figures sort of behind the scenes, like the party secretary, is still a bit more from that fringe. So who knows really how much of an influence that fringe will have in there. Most of these parties are polling at sort of 1% or less, but things could change, and if they start polling a little bit higher, they're unlikely to get into Parliament, but they might be polling high enough to, be on stage at debates and things, and get a bit of a platform doing that, and that can have an influence there, potentially reaching a new audience who might not have been that engaged with these ideas, but in an election year, might start looking for some of them, getting into these sort of alternative facts. So it's definitely something that we're going to see. I'm a little surprised actually that we haven't seen more noise from these groups yet, but I suppose the election's still nearly 7 months away, so there's still time for the campaigning to really get started. There's also groups like Voices for Freedom, which encourage their members to run in the local elections, but not under the Voices for Freedom banner. They, as far as I know, are not formally participating in any parties or campaigns with the general election, though there'll probably be a bit of overlap between members of Voices for Freedom and those parties I mentioned. What we might see more than that kind of direct intervention, though, is attempts to shape the narratives through things like reality check radio and other advertising. Voices for Freedom have a lot of money behind them. I often get asked where all that money's coming from, and to be honest, I can't say for certain. It's likely just from their own members. They claim to have a mailing list of 100,000 people, and have branches all around the country. But for their new radio platform, they've been advertising on buses and billboards and banners behind planes is one I've seen, and leaflets in, I think, at least in the big cities. I don't know how widely those leaflets have gone, but a lot of people have been getting them in their letterboxes. So there's a potential for them to influence the narrative there, and being not a political party, they're not going to be subject to some of the regulations around advertising that we have with elections. So if they are going to spend huge amounts of money promoting the idea that COVID was a hoax and the lockdowns were unnecessary and so forth, that's going to support the narrative that some of these fringe parties are promoting, but without being regulated and things, because it's not a political party campaigning. It's just this special interest group promoting their own ideas. So I think that's something to be aware of as well.
Byron, what about Matt King's Democracy NZ?
Oh yes, yeah, that's the one I forgot. Matt King's Democracy NZ. So Matt King, former National Party MP, attended the occupation of Parliament grounds last year, and from that launched his own political vehicle, Democracy NZ. And I haven't been following them super closely, but yeah, they're certainly pushing a lot of these similar conspiracy theories around COVID and so forth. They're I think they may be registered in one or two polls, sort of around that 1% mark. But yeah, I think it's a similar situation. They'll unlikely to get anywhere near Parliament, but could have an influence on that narrative through, just through doing their campaigning and potentially getting invited to candidate forums and debates and so on. So yeah, another one to be aware of. It gets a bit hard to keep track of them. There's always sort of 5 or 6 of these fringe parties promoting a similar worldview, but not so similar that they can all combine into one organization, it seems.
But they're specifically rural, aren't they? They've come out as specifically rural. So, what we're talking about tonight, those are the ones, that's the party that is targeting the rural vote.
Yeah, I think even more so than the Outdoors Party. I think, yeah, Democracy NZ's really, really going for votes from rural New Zealand, from the provinces. So probably one to keep a close eye on there if you're in that sphere.
They're also definitely anti-climate change.
Yeah, we've got at NIWA, we've got a massive OIA from their Waikato candidate at the moment.
Oh, yeah.
Series espoused by Ian Wishart and
amplified
by Sean Plunkett. And the quality of the conversation and the emails that we're getting are, to our inquiries inbox, they're not questions, they're rants, or the stuff which is scientists are being targeted, and it's really personal, nasty, unreasonable stuff. It's I suppose people in the medical fraternity and other places and politicians get this all the time, but it's the first time I've seen it, that we've been exposed to it like this in the 6 years that I've been at NIWA.
Sarah, and Sarah, I'm just going to add to that, because certainly I know with being with Federated Farmers through the whole Hei Waka Eke Noa process, the Hei Waka Eke Noa office had to deal with mountains of bizarre rants and just constant battering, really, of questions from a variety of different directions. And they tried to, deal with it all in the same upright, professional manner that they would deal with any inquiry. But you can see how it actually wears individuals down in government agencies when they have to deal with this stuff. And that's the idea, isn't it, Byron? That's kind of what the plan is, isn't it? To break people.
Yeah. Something I write a bit about in the Sovereign Citizens chapter is a tactic that is referred to as paper terrorism, and it's sort of largely refers to filing fake legal cases, or real legal cases, but for sort of frivolous needs. And I feel that if you use a really broad definition of that idea of paper terrorism, some of these sort of frivolous OIA things where it's just about having a bit of a rant and then getting some information, and then I feel like that it can be part of it too. It's this tactic to wear people down and to waste time and to just make things more difficult. I think in a lot of cases, it's like an OIA, they might not necessarily care too much about what information they're getting. It's more about wasting people's time and having a disruptive impact on things by doing this.
So I just wanted to ask about Stop Co-Governance, because I saw that I live in the Hut and they're coming to the Lower Hutt Little Theatre soon. So, but some of that language around the elite Māori who are having all the assets, and what have you seen about that Stop Co-Governance group, and what about the anti-Three Waters kind of movement? How much of that has been coordinated through some of these more extreme groups?
Yeah. So there's a bit of overlap there, but I think it's not entirely the same groups and individuals. I think there's this conspiracy narrative of a global elite trying to reshape the world, and then there's specifically New Zealand narrative about this like Maori elite or iwi elite who are trying to gain control of the country or take over all our water or land or whatever. But these narratives do sometimes get tied together through things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is what a lot of co-governance and things is coming out of. It's meeting sort of obligations under that. So there's definitely a way that these different conspiratorial worldviews can be influencing each other. From what I've seen so far, much of the sort of stop co-governance, anti-Three Waters stuff is emerged separately to the likes of Agriculture Action Group and Counterspin and so on. But there's some intermingling there, and that's something that could be could continue. I mean, certainly a lot of these groups, they target people who already have a skepticism of government or of institutions or of international organizations. And so I think there'll certainly be people who are pushing this bigger narrative of a global conspiracy, who will be looking for a susceptible audience among people who have believed this more New Zealand specific stuff about a iwi elite, and they'll be, getting in there with talk of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and then bringing in Agenda 21, 2030, and, WEF conspiracy theories. So, they're probably unlikely to ever sort of emerge into one organization, because there's so much, so many egos and so much infighting in this scene. But there could be a sort of cross-pollination of these conspiracy theories. So that's something I think to be conscious of.
So I'll just like to end on Andy's question, which is perfect for our audience. So what's the best way that broadcasters should discuss or cover these issues, understanding that we don't want to amplify these beliefs?
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of the concept of pre-bunking. So if you've heard the term debunking, it's sort of correcting false information afterwards, like when you do the fact check and you point out what's wrong with something that's been put out there. There's a lot of criticism of debunking. It's something like, I know Susie Wiles refuses to do it. She gets asked by the media to debunk vaccine misinformation, and she had an article on the Spin-Off a while back about, here's why I'm not going to debunk. And part of the problem is people might remember the false information as the correct information, or they might think, oh, this is a bit biased, let me go find the original and make up my own mind. Whereas pre-bunking is exposing people to the sort of criticism of misinformation and the correct information before they are exposed to that misinformation or disinformation. So it's like an inoculation, so that people have a bit of critical thinking there when they get exposed to something. So I think like you can cover Agenda 2021 conspiracy theories in a way that's not just directly responding to Agriculture Action Group spreading them. You can, so that when people hear these conspiracy theories from AAG or from Democracy NZ, they might already be familiar with them and know that they're conspiracy theories, because what's been covered there, has talked about them and has brought in experts. And similar thing with climate change stuff. You can look at what the misinformation is, find the correct what the correct information would be, and make sure people are exposed to that correct information before they get the misinformation. I think it's, you know, it's not an easy thing to do, and I think in my own work, I don't think I've always got it right with you know, pre-bunking versus debunking, or you know, giving which groups I give attention to. I've because I started before I'd written the book, I was doing like a YouTube channel, and so initially I was criticizing people who already had you know, much larger audiences than me. So it I didn't worry too much about giving them extra airtime because they already had a huge audience, you know, without what I was doing. But it's, yeah, probably a bit different if you're someone who's got that large audience already. You might want to be extra cautious about not driving people to these groups. But yeah, you can certainly still cover the things they're talking about, but do it in a way that, you know, allows people to think a bit critically when they later get exposed to that misinformation, because likely they will, whether that's on social media or whether that's you know, at a meeting somewhere that a group has organized, or, you know, seeing somebody at a candidates forum even. So I think we don't run the risk of exposing people to that misinformation that otherwise they'd never hear, because I think we can assume that they're going to hear it, they're going to be exposed to it at some point, and the thing will be to get in there first, you know, before that happens.
All right. Well, thank you for that. I might just stop the recording and
Okay.
then